In New Orleans, you learn early that old money does not weep when the matriarch dies. It calculates. My family gathered around a mahogany dining table, dry-eyed and dressed in tailored black, to announce that my grandmother had left me nothing. They slid a waiver across the wood, expecting me to sign away my rights, while they divided her estate right in front of my face. I sat quietly. I did not reach for a pen. What my father and sister did not know was that I had a sealed folder sitting in my apartment, hand-delivered by my grandmother's oldest friend, 3 days before her heart stopped, and I knew exactly who actually owned the roof over their heads. My name is Valeria Suara. Before I take you inside that dining room and show you how a quiet pharmacist dismantled a lineage of greed, hit like and subscribe to still drama stories, it means a lot to me. Drop your age, your city, and your local time in the comments. I read every single one. Let me take you back to a Tuesday in November, the day the clock started ticking. I was 28 years old, working the afternoon shift at the pharmacy. I am used to precision. I count medication down to the milligram. I manage my life and my income with the same clinical discipline. My phone buzzed in my lab coat pocket. It was my father, Preston. He did not ask if I was sitting down. He did not ask how my shift was going. He just said, "Genevieve passed an hour ago. The wake is at the house on Thursday at 4. Wear black, not navy. Be on time." Then he hung up. That was it. My grandmother, the only woman in that family who ever looked at me like a person instead of a utility, was gone. I drove to the Garden District estate on Thursday afternoon. The air was thick with that heavy Louisiana humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin. When I walked through the heavy front doors, the house smelled of white lilies and expensive catered food. I bypassed the crowded parlor and walked straight up the sweeping staircase to my grandmother's corner suite to say my own quiet goodbye. The room was cold. The bed was stripped and made tight, but my eyes caught the dresser. The antique silver hairbrush set she had kept there for 40 years was missing. I opened the top drawer. Her velvet jewelry boxes were stacked neatly, but every single one of them was empty. The faint outlines in the dust on the wood showed exactly where her valuables used to sit. They had not even waited for her to be in the ground. I stepped out onto the wraparound veranda to catch my breath. Just around the corner, hidden by the climbing jasmine, I heard my mother's voice. Caroline was not crying. She sounded like she was negotiating a corporate merger. "We need to get the appraiser in by Monday," she said to my sister Cassandra. "If we list the property quickly, we can close before the end of the year." I stood there staring at the wrought iron railing. They were not grieving. They were planning a payday, and they fully expected me to stay in the shadows and let them cash the check. I stepped back inside the house, leaving the scent of night-blooming jasmine and my mother's real estate ambitions out on the shadowed veranda. Confrontation is a messy tactic favored by amateurs. I prefer clinical observation. I walked past the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway and joined my family in the formal dining room. The funeral arrangements were already being treated like the social event of the season. The long mahogany table was littered with floral swatches and thick linen paper samples. Cassandra sat at my father's right side. She was 29 years old, wearing a dark silk dress that looked suspiciously like a fresh purchase specifically for the occasion. Cassandra was the golden investment of the Suara lineage. Preston had spent a fortune carefully cultivating her image. He paid for her elite private schools, her European summer tours, and the exorbitant down payment on her boutique that sold overpriced imported candles to tourists. The boutique operated at a loss every quarter, but in their social circle, the appearance of a business was far more important than actual revenue. I was the pharmacist. I paid my own state college tuition. I bought my own modest home. In a culture defined by centuries-old traditions and complex old money dynamics, my decision to earn a wage by standing behind a pharmacy counter was viewed as a quiet embarrassment. Yet for the last 4 years, I had been the one quietly keeping our grandmother alive. I covered the cost of Genevieve's complex cardiac medications, $400 every single month drawn from my own checking account. I never asked for reimbursement. I never brought it up at Thanksgiving dinners. I knew Preston's accounts were running terrifyingly thin, hidden behind tailored suits and exclusive country club memberships. My grandmother knew the truth as well. She would sit in her velvet armchair holding the amber pill bottles I brought her, and she would give me a look of profound understanding, a look that communicated everything we could never say aloud in a house built on pride. Cassandra leaned across the table and broke the silence. She slid a piece of heavy cream-colored cardstock toward me. It moved smoothly over the polished wood, coming to rest directly near my folded hands. It was an invoice from the most exclusive caterer in the French Quarter. $5,000. The itemized list included imported artisan cheeses, vintage wine pairings, and miniature lump crab cakes. All this to feed a parlor full of society acquaintances who had not bothered to visit Genevieve in 3 years. "We need this handled by tomorrow, Val," she said, not bothering to look up from her phone screen. She did not ask for a favor. She assigned a task. I looked at the invoice. Then I looked at her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her screen. Cassandra lived in a luxury high-rise funded by a father who was secretly drowning in commercial debt. I lived within my means, earning my living shift by shift, dispensing vital medication to people who actually needed it. I slid the thick paper back across the wood. It stopped precisely in front of her phone. "I cannot cover this invoice," I said. My voice was flat and even. It was the exact tone I use when explaining a strict dosage schedule to a difficult patient. Cassandra blinked. Her phone went face down on the mahogany. "What do you mean you cannot cover it?" she asked. "You make 6 figures counting pills." She delivered the sentence like a calculated insult, expecting me to shrink from the sting. My mother sighed, the weary, dramatic sigh of a woman burdened by a disobedient child. "Valeria, please do not be stubborn right now. Your sister is under an immense amount of stress coordinating this event. She is ensuring your grandmother receives the respect our family name demands." Preston set his bourbon glass down. The ice clinked against the crystal rim, a sharp warning sound cutting through the tension in the quiet room. "Your grandmother deserves a proper send-off," he said. His voice possessed that low rumble designed to make the listener feel small and compliant. "It is your duty to this family to contribute. We have all made sacrifices for this lineage. You need to step up and do your part." I looked at the man demanding my loyalty. I thought about the pharmacy receipts stacked neatly in my own kitchen drawer at home. 48 months of heart medication paid without a single word of gratitude from the people sitting across from me. "I have a mortgage, Preston," I said. "I stopped calling him Dad a long time ago, and I have already contributed to her care. I have contributed more than anyone sitting at this table." Preston's face darkened into a deep flush. He despised being reminded of his failures, especially financial ones. "You are ungrateful," he snapped. The word hung in the humid air of the dining room. Ungrateful. It is the favorite weapon of people who deeply resent you for noticing you are being used. You have always lacked the proper respect for this family's position in this city. Cassandra is carrying the heavy weight of the social arrangements. The least you can do to honor your grandmother is write a simple check and stop making everything about yourself. I looked at the three of them, forming a united front of pure entitlement. They did not see a grieving granddaughter sitting with them. They saw a wallet. They viewed me as a utility to be drained so they could maintain the illusion of wealth and social standing for a few more hours. I was the invisible workhorse expected to pull the carriage while they waved to the crowd. I stood up from the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not point fingers or demand an apology they were incapable of giving. I simply looked at the invoice, then at my sister. "Then you had better find a cheaper caterer," I said. I turned and walked out of the formal dining room. I heard the sharp scrape of Preston's chair pushing back and his voice rising behind me, but I did not stop. The words blurred into meaningless background noise. I walked through the grand foyer, out the heavy front doors, and stepped into the warm Louisiana evening. The drive back to my modest apartment was quiet. The thick evening heat pressed against the car windows, but inside the cabin I felt a strange, clarifying chill. My family had just shown me exactly who they were. They had demanded my hard-earned money to fund their elaborate social performance, while actively planning to discard me the moment the estate was settled. The overlapping layers of their financial abuse and emotional neglect had finally crystallized into plain view. For years, they had treated my career as a crude necessity, something they could look down upon while simultaneously relying on it to cover the gaps in their crumbling finances. They truly believed I was a passive utility meant to be drained and forgotten. They thought I would always bend to the pressure of keeping up appearances for the sake of the Suara name. I parked my car in the small lot behind my building and turned off the engine. I sat in the silence, gripping the steering wheel, and let the reality of the dinner table ambush wash over me. Preston had demanded $5,000 for crab cakes and wine, while Genevieve's actual life-extending medication had cost him nothing because he had silently passed that burden to me. He dared to call me ungrateful while living in a house he could barely afford, maintaining a lifestyle built entirely on credit and illusion. They were operating on an outdated map. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and their desperate need to project old money status that they failed to consider I might have a strategy of my own. They thought they held all the cards because they controlled the narrative inside that Grand Garden District house. They were wrong. They did not know about the quiet visitor who had come to my pharmacy counter while they were busy ignoring my grandmother's declining health. They had no idea what was waiting for me back at my apartment, resting in the dark corner of my bedroom closet. A heavy envelope that held the power to dismantle their entire kingdom. The overhead fluorescent bulbs buzzed with a relentless insect-like drone. It was 42 hours before the phone call that would declare my grandmother dead. Tuesday nights at the pharmacy always dragged pushing past midnight into a blurry stretch of counting hydrochlorothiazide pills and fielding insurance disputes. The air carried the sharp, sterile scent of bleach and isopropyl alcohol, a harsh contrast to the heavy magnolia perfume that usually clung to my family's Garden District parlor. I stood behind the raised linoleum counter, adjusting the collar of my white coat. A customer at the drive-through window was shouting about a late prescription refill. I resolved the discrepancy with the same detached clinical tone I would later use at the mahogany dining table. My profession requires a steady hand. One misplaced decimal point changes a cure into a poison. That same precision governed my personal life, especially where the Suara lineage was concerned. The automatic sliding glass doors parted with a mechanical swish. A gust of damp, humid wind swept into the brightly lit store, bringing with it a figure who looked entirely out of place among the aisles of discounted vitamins and seasonal greeting cards. It was Vivian. She wore a tailored charcoal trench coat, a silk scarf knotted at her neck, her silver hair pulled back into an immaculate twist. Vivian and my grandmother had been inseparable since 1952. They had shared decades of mint juleps on shaded patios, trading whispered truths about the crumbling finances of New Orleans high society. Vivian knew every skeleton buried beneath the polished floorboards of my father's house. Her face, usually flushed with sharp southern wit, was stark white. Her eyes darted toward the few straggling customers near the drop-off window. She did not take a paper number. She did not wait behind the yellow privacy line. She marched directly to the side consultation partition where I was verifying a prescription pad. Her leather heels clicked sharply against the tile echoing in the quiet store. "Valeria," she breathed, leaning over the low counter. She glanced over her shoulder, her posture rigid with an urgency I had never seen her display. She reached deep into the inner pocket of her trench coat and withdrew an object that seemed pulled from another century. It was a thick, heavy envelope crafted from dense woven parchment. A dark red wax seal secured the flap, stamped with an intricate vintage crest. She slid it across the smooth linoleum. The rough paper made a soft scratching sound as it moved toward my hands. I reached for it, my fingertips brushing the raised edge of the hardened wax. The envelope carried significant weight, suggesting a thick stack of formal documents inside. Vivian caught my wrist before I could lift the parcel. Her grip was startlingly strong, her rings pressing into my skin. "Your grandmother knows exactly what Preston intends to do," Vivian whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the commercial refrigerators holding the insulin supplies. "She knows he is desperate. She knows he will try to erase you the moment her heart stops beating." I stared at the red wax, my pulse drumming a sudden rapid rhythm against my ribs. I knew Preston was cornered by his own terrible commercial real estate investments, but hearing Vivian voice the threat made the impending danger undeniable. My father was not just a greedy man, he was a drowning man, and drowning men will pull anyone under to save themselves. "Do not open this tonight," Vivian commanded, her gaze locking onto mine with fierce intensity. "Do not look at the contents tomorrow. You must promise me, Valeria. You keep this hidden. You let Preston play his hand. You let your sister gloat. You wait until they are sitting at that long table staring down at you, convinced they have successfully stripped you of your legacy. Open this only when they think they have won, not a single second before." Before I could formulate a question, before I could ask how much time Genevieve actually had left, Vivian released my wrist. She pulled her silk scarf tighter around her neck, turned on her heel, and walked out into the dark Louisiana night. The automatic doors slid shut behind her, cutting off the sound of the approaching rain. I stood paralyzed behind the consultation desk, the heavy parchment resting against my palm. The drive-through bell chimed again, a harsh reminder of the present reality. I slipped the envelope into the deep pocket of my lab coat. It felt like carrying a live explosive. For the remainder of my shift, every movement I made was hypersensitive to the weight resting against my hip. My clinical mind raced through permutations of what those pages could contain: a revised will, a letter of confession, a trust provision. Whatever Genevieve had orchestrated, she had done it in total secrecy, bypassing the expensive family lawyers Preston kept on his payroll. When my break arrived at 3 in the morning, I retreated to the employee locker room in the back corridor. The space was narrow, smelling of stale coffee and damp cardboard. I opened my metal locker, the rusted hinges squeaking in the quiet room. I placed the red wax-sealed folder at the very bottom, burying it beneath my spare scrubs and a pair of running shoes. I closed the metal door and spun the combination dial lock. I leaned my forehead against the cool steel, exhaling a long, unsteady breath. That envelope was a wild card introduced into a game I thought I was destined to lose. For the next 3 days, I carried the burden of that hidden truth. I visited Genevieve in her final hours, holding her frail hand, while Preston paced the hospital hallway, barking orders into his cell phone about property appraisals. I watched my sister scroll through luxury car listings on her tablet while sitting in the intensive care waiting area. They were circling the prize, ignorant of the fact that I held an unopened countermeasure locked in a sterile employee break room across town. Now driving back from the disastrous funeral planning dinner, where they had demanded $5,000 for crab cakes, the memory of Vivian's urgent whisper echoed in the confines of my car. Let them play their hand. Let them think they have won. The directive required a level of stoicism that bordered on masochism. I had to endure their relentless condescension. I had to swallow the blatant insults Preston hurled at my career. I had to watch Cassandra parade around the Garden District estate, claiming a crown she had done nothing to earn. My family operated on the assumption that silence equated to submission. They mistook my refusal to engage in petty shouting matches for a lack of intelligence. Preston believed his booming patriarch routine would frighten me into signing away my rights. Cassandra believed her designer clothes and country club accent made her inherently superior to a woman who wore a name tag to work. They had constructed a flawless narrative wherein they were the rightful heirs to a sprawling fortune, and I was a minor inconvenience to be swept out the back door. Tomorrow was the formal reception. The grand house would be packed with the city's elite, the very people Preston needed to impress to secure new loans and mask his impending ruin. He would use the gathering to project strength, wealth, and unshakable control. He would parade me around as a prop, the dutiful, unremarkable daughter running errands, ensuring the caterers kept the champagne flutes full. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I would play my part. I would serve the drinks. I would endure the dismissive glances and the whispered pity from the society wives who viewed my pharmacy uniform as a tragic lack of ambition. I would let Preston build his towering monument to his own arrogance, knowing that an unread stack of papers waited in the dark, ready to reduce his entire kingdom to ash. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Garden District estate. Inside the house, the funeral reception bore zero resemblance to a place of mourning. The gathering operated exactly like the gala events my family used to throw before my father began hemorrhaging capital on terrible commercial real estate investments. A hired string quartet played a soft classical arrangement in the corner of the grand parlor. Waitstaff wove through the crowded rooms carrying silver trays laden with the exact artisan cheeses and vintage wine pairings I had refused to finance just days earlier. Preston and Caroline held court near the grand fireplace. They wore their grief like expensive tailored garments, performing the roles of devastated aristocratic heirs with chilling perfection. My mother dabbed her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief whenever a society wife offered condolences, and seamlessly transitioned the conversation to the surging property values in our neighborhood. I did not stand in the receiving line. I was in the kitchen hallway, directing the caterers because my sister had abandoned the logistical duties the moment the first guest walked through the front door. I stepped out of the service corridor to locate the head waiter holding a stack of linen napkins in my hands. That was when I heard Cassandra speaking above the low hum of the cello. She stood near the open French doors leading to the courtyard, leaning intimately toward a man I recognized immediately. Arthur Vance was a prominent real estate developer whose high-rise projects were reshaping the city skyline. Cassandra held a flute of champagne, laughing a fraction too loudly at something he said. I paused behind a towering floral arrangement of white lilies and observed the transaction. My sister ran a boutique that was quietly failing. She struggled to make rent every month on an overpriced commercial lease she had signed solely for the prestige of the zip code. Now she was leveraging a dead woman to secure her next lifeline. I am looking to diversify my portfolio, Cassandra purred, taking a slow sip of her drink. With grandmother passing, the estate transfer is imminent. It is a substantial fortune. I am highly interested in anchoring the ground floor retail space of your new waterfront development. I stood perfectly still behind the flowers. The sheer arrogance of her performance was breathtaking. She was committing phantom capital to a ruthless developer before a single legal document had been processed by the parish. She was promising him liquid cash she believed she would extract from the very walls surrounding us. I noted the hungry gleam in the developer's eyes. Arthur Vance was a predator wrapped in Italian wool. He smiled down at Cassandra, indulging her performance because he recognized a desperate investor willing to overlook unfavorable contract terms. Cassandra smelled salvation. Neither of them realized they were negotiating with monopoly money. I smoothed the linen napkins in my grip and walked away, leaving my sister to dig a hole she would never be able to climb out of. I navigated the crowded parlor to discreetly inform my father that the catering manager needed a signature for the staff overtime hours. Preston was standing near the antique mahogany bar, engaged in deep conversation with Judge Harrison. The judge was a man whose rulings dictated the fate of half the corporate disputes in our jurisdiction. Preston held a crystal tumbler of top-shelf bourbon, gesturing expansively with his free hand. He was laying the groundwork for his own financial resurrection, using his proximity to judicial power as a social shield. I approached quietly, waiting for a natural pause in their dialogue. Judge Harrison noticed me first. He offered a polite, inquiring nod. Preston turned around. For a fraction of a second, his eyes flashed with profound irritation at the interruption. He quickly masked the annoyance with a smooth, paternal smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ah," Preston said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "Judge Harrison, this is the girl who handles the pharmacy runs for Mother. She was quite helpful with the medication logistics toward the end." I felt the air in my lungs turn to ice. He did not use my name. He did not claim me as his flesh and blood. In a room overflowing with the city elite, my father deliberately stripped me of my lineage. He reduced my entire existence, my hard-earned doctoral degree, my years of silent financial sacrifice, to the status of a hired delivery driver. He needed to distance himself from the working-class stain of a daughter who punched a clock for a living. The judge offered a brief, dismissive smile and turned back to his bourbon, immediately erasing me from his memory. I watched my father's shoulders relax. He had successfully neutralized the threat of my existence and preserved the immaculate facade of the Suara legacy. A younger version of myself might have demanded a proper introduction. I might have listed my medical credentials or stated loudly that I was the reason Genevieve lived long enough to die a natural death. But the clinical detachment of my profession grounded my feet to the floor. You do not argue with a symptom, you observe it. Preston was confirming the exact diagnosis Vivian had delivered 3 nights ago at my pharmacy counter. I simply nodded to the judge, placed the catering clipboard on the edge of the mahogany bar, and walked away. The insult did not break my spirit. It liberated my conscience. Every remaining shred of familial obligation dissolved right there on the polished hardwood floor. The reception stretched into the early evening. The string quartet packed their instruments and departed through the side gate. The crowd of society guests began to thin out, leaving only empty glasses and the lingering scent of stale wine. The silence that settled over the grand house was heavy and charged with the unspoken agenda my family had been harboring all afternoon. The time for performative grief was over. The time for acquisition had arrived. I was gathering discarded champagne flutes near the veranda when a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the quiet house. It was the distinct chime of a silver spoon striking a heavy crystal tumbler. Preston stood at the entrance to the formal dining room. His tailored suit jacket was unbuttoned, and his posture radiated absolute authority. The remaining caterers froze in their tracks. Carolyn and Cassandra immediately stopped their hushed conversation near the fireplace and turned their attention to the patriarch. Preston did not address the hired help. He looked directly at my mother, my sister, and finally, his gaze locked onto me. "I need the immediate family in the dining room," he announced. His voice was a low command brooking zero defiance. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. "I have spent the afternoon reviewing Mother's personal effects in her private study. I discovered her final wishes. We are going to read them right now." I stood holding a tray of dirty glasses. The audacity of his statement was staggering. Legal protocol mandated the presence of a sworn estate attorney. It required filed documents, neutral witnesses, and formal probate procedures recognized by the state of Louisiana. Preston was bypassing the entire judicial system. He was relying on the sheer force of his intimidation to steamroll his family into accepting whatever narrative he had constructed behind closed doors. He was treating the distribution of a multi-million-dollar legacy like a private boardroom negotiation where he held all the voting shares. He turned his back and walked into the dining room, leaving the heavy double doors wide open. Caroline followed immediately, her posture rigid with anticipation. Cassandra shot me a triumphant predatory smirk before gliding after our mother. The trap was officially set. They had built a stage, written a script, and positioned me perfectly for the final act of my own erasure. I set the silver tray down on a side table. I smoothed the front of my black dress. I walked toward the open doors, stepping into the room where my father believed he was about to finalize his victory. The heavy double doors of the formal dining room clicked shut with a solid, definitive thud. The brass latch engaged, sealing us inside a space that felt less like a gathering area and more like an interrogation chamber. The velvet drapes had been drawn tight against the evening heat, casting the room in dim yellow light from the crystal chandelier above. I stood near the foot of the long mahogany table. Preston positioned himself at the head, his hands resting flat against the polished wood. Caroline took her seat to his left, her posture rigid. Cassandra claimed the chair to his right, smoothing the fabric of her dark dress. There was a glaring absence in the room. No notary public sat waiting in the corner. No independent estate attorney stood by with a sealed leather briefcase. We were isolated. This was a deliberate tactical choice. My family operated on the belief that authority was not derived from the law, but from the volume of their voices and the expense of their tailored clothing. Preston reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket. He did not extract an aged parchment or a thick-bound legal portfolio. He pulled out 3 sheets of stark white standard printer paper. The pages were pristine, uncreased, and bore no watermarks or official parish stamps. He smoothed them out before him, clearing his throat with a practiced theatrical weight. He looked at each of us in turn, ensuring he commanded the full attention of his audience. "I have spent the afternoon poring over your grandmother's private study," he began, his baritone voice filling the quiet space. It was an arduous task, but a necessary one. In her personal desk, I located her final written directives regarding the distribution of her worldly possessions. She wanted to ensure a seamless transition of the Swara legacy. He adjusted his posture, standing a fraction taller. He possessed a talent for masking raw greed beneath a veneer of aristocratic duty. For his entire adult life, Preston had treated the family wealth as his own personal treasury, bleeding it dry on failed commercial real estate ventures, while projecting the image of a savvy investor. He needed Genevieve's estate to plug the gaping holes in his ledger. He began to read aloud from the crisp pages, holding them up to catch the chandelier light. The document he recited was a masterpiece of flowery, pretentious prose. It spoke of honoring ancestral roots and preserving the dignity of the lineage. Then it moved to the mathematics of the theft. Preston read the fabricated clauses that cleanly divided the entirety of the $2.5 million estate. The sprawling Garden District home, the liquid trusts, the antique silver collections, and the stock portfolios were allocated with surgical precision. The bulk of the assets were directed to Preston, designated as the primary steward, charged with managing the properties for future generations. The remaining liquid capital was assigned directly to Cassandra, framed as seed money to secure her future business endeavors. My name was conspicuously absent from the distribution of wealth. According to the pages Preston held, my only inheritance was the supposed knowledge that my family would continue to thrive without me. I remained standing at the foot of the table. I did not gasp. I did not demand to inspect the papers. I did not dissolve into the predictable tears they were so eager to witness. Instead, I allowed my professional training to override my human instinct. In the pharmacy, when a patient presents a forged prescription pad, they rely on confidence to push the transaction through. They speak loudly, they demand fast service, and they attempt to fluster the technician. A seasoned pharmacist ignores the noise and examines the physiological symptoms of the person standing across the counter. I applied that same clinical scrutiny to my own blood relatives. I watched my father. Despite his booming voice and practiced delivery, his respiratory rate was slightly elevated. His breaths were shallow, causing the fabric of his suit vest to rise and fall in a rapid, uneven cadence. He was exerting an immense amount of physical energy to maintain his facade of control. I shifted my gaze to my sister. Cassandra stared straight ahead, wearing a mask of haughty indifference. Yet her right hand rested on the mahogany surface, and her manicured acrylic nails tapped a frantic, irregular rhythm against the wood. It was the telltale physical manifestation of a soaring heart rate. She was anticipating a payout, but her nervous system betrayed her underlying panic. She knew they were executing a high-wire act over a canyon without a net. Finally, I looked at my mother. Caroline had traded her moral compass for country club status decades ago, choosing the comfort of Preston's illusions over the harsh reality of his failures. She sat perfectly still, but she refused to elevate her gaze. Her eyes remained locked on a faint water stain near the center of the Persian rug. She could not bring herself to look at the daughter she was actively helping to rob. Guilt has a specific gravity, and it was holding her head down. The diagnosis was clear. This was not a legal proceeding. It was a desperate stage play. The pristine printer paper lacked the mandatory notarization, the witness signatures, and the complex legal formatting required by Louisiana probate law. Preston had likely drafted the document himself in his home office, mere hours after Genevieve took her final breath. He was banking on my supposed ignorance and my ingrained habit of avoiding conflict. He believed that the sheer weight of his patriarchal authority would crush any instinct I had to challenge him. They needed me to accept this charade as absolute reality because they possessed no actual legal mechanism to enforce it. The tension in the mahogany dining room thickened, turning the air stale and oppressive. Preston reached the final paragraph of his fabricated testament. He lowered the pages and let them rest on the table. He clasped his hands together and adopted a look of profound solemnity. "It is a heavy burden to bear," he said, his voice dropping an octave. But Mother knew what was best for the preservation of our standing in this city. She understood who possessed the acumen to carry the Swara name forward. He waited for my reaction. He wanted the explosion. He wanted me to scream about the injustice so he could calmly label me hysterical and justify my exclusion. Cassandra stopped tapping her nails, leaning forward slightly like a predator, anticipating the struggle of trapped prey. Caroline squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable shouting match. I gave them nothing. I stood anchored to the floor, my breathing slow and measured. I cataloged their symptoms, their desperation, their naked vulnerability hiding behind tailored clothes. The silence stretched out, becoming a physical weight in the room. They had fired their best weapon, and the target had simply refused to fall. I watched the confidence slowly begin to drain from my father's face, replaced by a creeping shadow of uncertainty. He had orchestrated the perfect ambush, but he had fundamentally miscalculated the victim. I was not the obedient delivery girl they thought they knew. I was a professional accustomed to navigating high-stakes environments where panic leads to fatal errors. And I knew with crystalline certainty that their entire victory was a fragile illusion waiting to be shattered. The quiet in the room was not peaceful. It was the heavy, expectant atmosphere that precedes a scheduled execution. Preston let the final syllable of his fabricated testament hang in the air, allowing the weight of my supposed disinheritance to settle over my shoulders. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted the grand surroundings, the towering bookshelves, and the ancestral portraits on the walls to remind me of exactly what I was losing. But a person cannot lose what they never valued in the first place. He folded his hands over the uncreased pages and tilted his head. His expression morphed from solemn patriarch to disappointed judge. The transition was smooth-honed by decades of deflecting blame for his own financial ruin onto anyone standing nearby. Now it was my turn to absorb the fault. "I am certain this is difficult to process," Preston said, his tone dripping with patronizing sympathy. But Genevieve was a woman of fierce principles. She believed in preserving the dignity of our lineage above all else. He paused, ensuring my mother and sister were watching my face. She felt that you lacked the proper respect for our family traditions. You chose a common path. In her eyes, that choice demonstrated a severe deficit in loyalty. She concluded that entrusting you with any portion of the Swara estate would be a disservice to the generations who built it. A common path. The phrase echoed off the mahogany paneling. To Preston and his carefully curated circle, pursuing an education, securing a medical license, and earning a median salary by standing on my feet 10 hours a day was an act of vulgarity. Old money dictates that wealth should be inherited, married into, or generated through obscure investment portfolios. Laboring for a paycheck was viewed as a lower-class affliction. They conveniently ignored the fact that my common path had provided the steady influx of cash required to keep Genevieve's failing heart beating while Preston squandered his inherited capital on hollow prestige. To my right, Cassandra shifted in her heavy wooden chair. She raised her crystal tumbler to her lips. The ice cubes clinked, a sharp, bright sound of celebration. She took a slow, deliberate sip of bourbon, her eyes never leaving my face. A deeply satisfied smirk played at the corners of her mouth. She was drinking to my exile. For years, she had harbored a quiet resentment toward my independence, masking her own profound insecurities beneath designer labels and society gossip. My financial stability terrified her because it exposed her own reliance on a father who was rapidly running out of funds. Seeing me legally erased from the family ledger was the ultimate vindication for her fragile ego. Preston was not finished. The insult was merely the anesthetic designed to numb me for the actual procedure. He reached into his tailored jacket a second time. The fluidity of his movements indicated that this sequence had been rehearsed. He withdrew another sheet of paper, this one separate from his supposed testament. He placed it face down on the table, smoothed the edges with his palms, and then pushed it forward. The paper glided across the polished mahogany, coming to a halt, precisely inches from my folded hands. Next, he unclipped a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket and laid it gently beside the document. We understand that emotions run high during these tragic transitions. Preston continued dropping the faux sympathy and adopting a brisk, transactional cadence. We wish to honor your grandmother's memory with dignity. We want to avoid any unpleasantness, any drawn-out disputes that might drag our name through the mud. This is a standard waiver. It simply states that you accept the terms of the final wishes, as I have read them, and that you relinquish any right to contest the distribution of the estate. He leaned back in his chair, exuding an aura of invincibility. Sign it, Valeria! Let us prevent any ugly legal battles. Do this one honorable thing for the family, and you can return to your pharmacy without any further obligations to us. The air in the dining room turned brittle. This was the precise moment they had built the entire evening around. The trap was fully deployed. They expected the emotional dam to break. Caroline finally lifted her gaze from the rug, her eyes wide, bracing for the scream. Cassandra leaned forward, slightly eager, to witness the tears hungry for the breakdown that would validate her superiority. Preston watched me with the cold, unblinking focus of a warden expecting compliance. They were waiting for me to cry, to beg for a meager fraction of the inheritance, or to launch into a hysterical rage about fairness. Any of those reactions would confirm their narrative that I was unstable, greedy, and rightfully excluded. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I reached forward and picked up the document. The paper felt flimsy between my fingers, lacking the heavy, textured weight of official legal stock. I did not look at my father. I directed my entire focus to the printed text, applying the same rigorous scrutiny I use when verifying complex narcotics prescriptions. When lives are on the line, a pharmacist learns to scan for discrepancies instantly. An incorrect dosage, a missing registration number, a forged signature line. You train your eyes to catch the flaws that amateur counterfeiters always miss. I read the waiver. The deception unraveled within seconds. The margins were uneven, suggesting the text had been hastily copied and pasted from an online template. The language was a clumsy amalgamation of television legal jargon and outdated probate terminology. It cited statutes that had been revised by the Louisiana legislature years ago. But the most glaring failure, the fatal flaw in Preston's grand performance, was located at the bottom of the page. There was no signature block for a neutral witness. There was no designated space for a parish seal. Most importantly, there was zero provision for a notary public. In the state of Louisiana, a document demanding the relinquishment of inheritance rights is entirely worthless without a certified notary present to verify the identity and willingness of the signatory. The realization washed over me cool and clarifying. Preston had not consulted an estate attorney. He could not afford one, or no legitimate lawyer would agree to participate in such a blatant, clumsy fraud. He had manufactured this entire crisis in his home office, utilizing a standard laser printer and his own inflated sense of superiority. He was attempting to steal a multi-million-dollar estate with a piece of paper that would not hold up in a small claims court. The silence in the room stretched, pulling tighter and tighter, until the tension felt like a physical wire ready to snap. The seconds ticked by, marked by the heavy swinging pendulum of the grandfather clock in the distant hallway. My family held their collective breath. They interpreted my silent reading as shock, mistaking my careful analysis for devastation. They thought I was paralyzed by the weight of their rejection. I kept my eyes on the flawed, pathetic document, allowing them to endure the agonizing weight. I studied the cheap ink, the crooked alignment, the sheer desperation baked into every printed syllable. This was the great Swara dynasty reduced to printing fake waivers on a Tuesday evening to stave off bankruptcy. Their grand kingdom was nothing but a hollow stage set propped up by lies and held together by the terrified hope that I would be too emotional to read the fine print. With deliberate, unhurried precision, I lowered the paper. I did not toss it back at him. I did not crumple it. I placed it gently back onto the polished mahogany, aligning the edges perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. I left the gold fountain pen untouched. I raised my head, meeting my father's expectant gaze with a look of unnerving tranquility. The emotional execution they had planned had failed, and the quiet truth of their vulnerability was suddenly the loudest thing in the room. I kept my gaze locked on Preston. The silence in the dining room had reached its absolute limit, stretched so taut it practically vibrated against the mahogany-paneled walls. I did not launch into a passionate defense of my character. I did not list the countless times I had subsidized my grandmother's health care while he paraded around exclusive country clubs on borrowed credit. Explanations are a currency you only spend on people who are capable of understanding your worth. I refused to waste another syllable, justifying my existence to a man who viewed me as a disposable asset. I leaned back slightly, unclasped my hands, and delivered a single devastating sentence. I do not sign unnotarized drafts. The sheer glacial coldness of that refusal shattered the performative calm of the room. It was not a plea for fairness. It was a clinical rejection of his entire fabricated reality. For a fraction of a second, Preston simply stared at me. His cognitive gears visibly ground to a halt as he attempted to process the failure of his grand ambush. He had expected weeping. He had expected a submissive daughter desperate to cling to the fringes of high society. He was entirely unprepared for a meticulous pharmacist auditing his fake legal documents with the same detachment she used to verify inventory. The realization hit him, and the shift was terrifying. The veneer of the sorrowful patriarch dissolved in an instant, replaced by the volatile, unpredictable rage of a cornered predator. A dangerous, mottled crimson flush crept up his neck, swallowing his collar and consuming his face. He raised his right hand and brought it down hard against the polished table. The impact produced a sharp cracking sound that caused the crystal bourbon glasses to jump and shudder, sending amber droplets spilling onto the expensive wood. "How dare you speak to me about legalities in my own home?" Preston bellowed. The facade of old money elegance vanished, exposing the desperate, flailing man underneath. He began shouting about hierarchy, about the centuries of tradition that dictated unquestioning loyalty to the head of the Swara household. This was his inherited playbook. His own father had ruled the lineage with an iron fist, and genuine wealth crushing descent through immense financial leverage. Preston was attempting to execute the same tyrannical maneuvers, tragically ignorant of the fact that intimidation requires actual leverage. He possessed none. He was a king screaming orders from a throne made of unpaid invoices and mounting commercial debts. "You owe everything to this family," he roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings and the ancestral portraits that seemed to watch the spectacle with painted indifference. "You will show the proper deference, or you will find yourself cut off from the society that birthed you." My mother jumped into the fray, her earlier guilt morphing swiftly into venomous self-preservation. Caroline had spent her entire adult life sacrificing her own moral agency to maintain her status as a Garden District socialite. She married into the Swara name and guarded it viciously, terrified of slipping back into the obscurity from which she came. She could not comprehend a daughter who willingly rejected the illusion of aristocratic privilege. To Caroline, my independence was a personal insult to her own life choices. "You are trying to tear us apart," Caroline accused, her voice trembling with misplaced indignation. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "You have always been so bitterly jealous of your sister. You cannot stand to see Cassandra inherit the legacy she actually embraces. You are doing this out of pure spiteful envy because you know you do not belong in our world." I let the noise wash over me. Their accusations were frantic, uncoordinated strikes aimed at provoking a reaction. I ignored the barrage of insults. Reacting would grant their fabricated crisis a legitimacy it did not deserve. I stood up from my chair, my movements deliberately slow and unhurried. I smoothed the front of my black dress, ensuring my posture reflected the absolute tranquility I felt inside. I reached for my dark coat, draped over the back of the adjacent chair, and slipped it on, adjusting the collar with meticulous care. My refusal to engage infuriated them further. It stripped them of their power. A manipulator thrives on the emotional turmoil they inflict. By offering them a blank, unbothered canvas, I was starving them of the exact fuel they required to sustain their delusion. They wanted a screaming match to justify their cruelty. I gave them only the chilling silence of someone who has already moved on. I turned my back on the grand table and began walking toward the heavy double doors. My measured footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor, a steady rhythmic departure from a lineage I was finally severing. I walked past the antique sideboards, past the silver serving trays that I had refused to pay to fill past the curated history of a family that had rotting foundations. The sight of my retreating back pushed Cassandra over the edge, her smug composure fractured, giving way to the shrill panic of a woman terrified that her imaginary fortune might somehow evaporate before she could spend it. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her manicured nails digging into the wood. Cassandra had never earned a single dollar of her own. Her boutique was a vanity project funded by Preston. The concept of securing her own livelihood was terrifying to her, so she projected that terror onto me. "You get nothing!" Cassandra shrieked, her voice cracking into an ugly, discordant pitch that echoed through the grand room. "Do you hear me? You walk out that door and you get nothing at all." I did not turn around. I did not break my stride. Cassandra was right about one specific detail. I was getting nothing from them. But I had never sought their charity. I had built a life that did not require their permission to exist. I reached out, grasped the cold brass handles, and pulled the heavy dining room doors open, stepping out into the expansive, dimly lit foyer. I left them trapped in that room, drowning in the toxic swamp of their own making. I walked out of the estate and crossed the wide veranda. The thick, oppressive humidity of the Louisiana evening enveloped me the moment I stepped past the wrought iron gates. The air smelled of damp earth, Spanish moss, and incoming rain. It was a cleansing, elemental scent that cleared the suffocating odor of stale bourbon and lies from my lungs. The historic mansions of the neighborhood stood silent and imposing under the glow of the street lamps, monuments to a bygone era that my family was desperately trying to cling to. I unlocked my car, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. Almost instantaneously, my cell phone began to vibrate in the center console. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of notifications. Preston was launching a frantic digital assault. The text messages arrived in a furious, disjointed stream, escalating in their severity. He warned me that my insubordination had permanent consequences. He declared that I was officially excommunicated from the Swara family, promising to ensure my name was disgraced in every medical circle and social club in New Orleans. He was attempting to exert control from a distance, firing blank ammunition into the dark. I did not reach for the device. I let the phone rattle against the hard plastic tray, the digital tantrums serving as a pathetic soundtrack to my liberation. My pulse was remarkably steady. I shifted the car into gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving the imposing, deceitful architecture of the Garden District in my rearview mirror. My eyes remained locked on the dark asphalt unspooling ahead of my headlights. The chaotic noise of my family's unraveling faded into insignificance. My mind was no longer occupied by their desperate theatrics or their hollow threats. Every ounce of my cognitive focus was directed toward my modest apartment across town. I visualized the quiet sanctuary of my living room, the locked safe in my closet, and the heavy parchment envelope currently waiting for me in the dark. Vivienne had issued a precise, unmistakable directive 3 nights ago at the pharmacy counter. I was to wait until they believed they had secured their victory. I was to let them gloat, let them reveal their true intentions, and let them officially cast me aside. They had played their hand flawlessly. They had delivered their grand verdict, presented their forged documents, and banished me from their fabricated empire. The conditions for opening the envelope had been perfectly met. As I navigated the humid, rain-slicked streets of the city, the anticipation sharpened my focus. The real battle was not the shouting match I had just walked away from. The real battle was locked beneath a dark red wax seal, and I was finally ready to discover the truth my grandmother had left behind. The quiet of my apartment enveloped me the moment I locked the deadbolt. It was a profound, sheltering silence, a sharp contrast to the suffocating theatricality I had just escaped in the Garden District. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The glow from the street lamps filtering through the blinds provided enough illumination to navigate my modest living room. I hung my dark coat on the hook by the door and kicked off my shoes. My phone was still vibrating in my purse, a relentless, frantic rhythm of incoming messages from Preston and Cassandra. I reached into the bag, powered the device down, and tossed it onto the sofa cushion. Their digital tantrums held zero authority here. I walked down the short hallway to my bedroom, my mind clear and singular in its focus. I knelt on the floor and opened the small fireproof safe tucked into the corner of my closet. I reached inside and retrieved the heavy parchment envelope Vivienne had slid across my pharmacy counter 3 nights prior. In the quiet of my own space, the parcel felt even more substantial. The dark red wax seal remained pristine, bearing the intricate vintage crest that spoke of generations long past. I carried the envelope back to my small kitchen table, the same inexpensive wooden table where I often sat grading continuing education modules or calculating my monthly budget. I sat down, took a deep breath, and broke the wax seal. The hardened material snapped with a crisp, satisfying sound. I opened the flap and withdrew a thick stack of documents. These were not standard sheets of printer paper freshly generated from a home office laserjet. They were heavy textured legal stock bound by brass brads at the top margin. My eyes immediately caught the blue ink of official parish clerk stamps gracing the upper right corners of the pages. Raised notary seals pressed into the bottom of the sheets, giving the paper a physical, tactile authority. This was not a drafted suggestion or a desperate bluff. This was ironclad registered Louisiana law. I smoothed the first page flat against the table and began to read with the same rigorous scrutiny I apply to complex pharmacological formulations. The header of the primary document was bold and unmistakable: Act of Donation, Inter Vivos. My clinical training kicked in, processing the dense, archaic terminology and translating it into plain, terrifying truth. In Louisiana, an inter vivos donation is a highly specific legal instrument. It is an immediate, irrevocable transfer of property from a living person to another living person. It bypasses the probate process, entirely removing the assets from the traditional estate before the original owner even passes away. I traced my finger down the page, absorbing the meticulous details. The donor was listed as Genevieve Suara. The donee, the sole recipient of the transfer, was listed as Valeria Suara. I turned to the second page, my heart establishing a slow, powerful rhythm. The document contained an exhaustive, itemized inventory of the transferred assets. It detailed the sprawling historic estate located in the Garden District, down to the precise square footage and property boundary markers. It listed the antique silver collections, the inherited artwork, and the extensive portfolio of liquid trusts held in offshore accounts. Every single item of value that Preston had confidently divided at the mahogany table hours earlier was explicitly cataloged on these stamped pages. Then I reached the clause that revealed the true genius of my grandmother's strategy. Genevieve had transferred the bare ownership of the entire estate to me, but she had legally retained the usufruct. I sat back in my chair, letting the magnitude of that single word wash over me. Usufruct is a unique provision in Southern civil law. It granted Genevieve the absolute legal right to continue residing in the Garden District mansion and to utilize the income generated by the liquid assets for the remainder of her natural life. To the outside observer, nothing had changed. Preston, Caroline, and Cassandra continued to walk the halls of that grand house, operating under the delusion that it belonged to the Suara lineage and would inevitably pass to them. They treated Genevieve as a fading fixture in a kingdom they were eager to inherit. I checked the execution date printed clearly beside the notary's signature. The documents had been finalized, signed, and officially recorded with the parish exactly 36 months ago. The realization hit me with the force of a falling beam. 3 full years ago, while I was quietly working night shifts to fund her exorbitant cardiac medications, and while Preston was strutting through exclusive country clubs, projecting an aura of immense wealth, Genevieve had orchestrated a surgical legal strike. She had recognized the vultures circling her bed. She had seen Preston drowning in his own foolish commercial real estate debts, and she knew he would not hesitate to liquidate her legacy to save his own pride. She also knew he would viciously cut me out of the narrative the moment she was gone. Instead of waiting for a messy probate battle where Preston could leverage his connections to contest a standard, will Genevieve simply remove the prize from the board? Preston's unnotarized, freshly printed testament was not just a pathetic forgery, it was a comical impossibility. He had stood at the head of that formal dining room attempting to bequeath a multi-million-dollar estate that his mother had not owned for 3 years. He was fighting a war for a ghost kingdom. Every threat he hurled at me, every demand for my signature on his fake waiver, was predicated on an inheritance that had already been legally relocated into my possession. Genevieve had played the frail, fading matriarch flawlessly, allowing her greedy son to believe he held all the power, while she quietly handed the keys to the castle to the only granddaughter who possessed actual integrity. I stared at the thick stack of papers, a profound sense of awe mingling with the cool night air filtering through my kitchen window. Genevieve had seen me. She had recognized the invisible workhorse pulling the weight of the family, and she had rewarded that silent loyalty with the ultimate protection. She had armed me with an unbreakable shield. But a shield is only effective if you know how to wield it against the incoming assault. The initial shock of the revelation began to recede, replaced by a sharp, tactical awareness of the impending fallout. Preston was not merely an arrogant man, he was a deeply desperate one. The Garden District estate was not just a symbol of his social standing. It was the vital collateral he desperately needed to appease the creditors currently circling his failing commercial ventures. Once he attempted to file his fraudulent paperwork with the parish and discovered the truth, his arrogance would curdle into sheer existential terror. A drowning man denied his last remaining lifeline does not surrender gracefully. He thrashes. He attempts to pull everyone nearby down into the dark water with him. Preston would inevitably realize that his grand performance had been a spectacular failure, and that the quiet pharmacist he had dismissed as a common laborer now held the deed to his entire reality. He would deploy every dirty tactic, every shred of social leverage, and every aggressive legal maneuver he could invent to break the ironclad donation. He would attempt to claim Genevieve was incompetent or coerced, relying on his network of influential friends to pressure the judicial system. I could not simply walk into the parish courthouse alone and expect a seamless victory. I needed a strategist. I needed an architect of legal defense who understood the brutal underbelly of Southern wealth disputes and possessed the fortitude to stand against Preston's blustering intimidation. I needed a professional who navigated the intricate maze of property law with the same clinical precision I used to dispense vital medication. I carefully gathered the heavy parchment pages, aligning the edges with deliberate care. I returned the documents to the wax-sealed envelope and carried the package back to my bedroom. I placed it securely inside the fireproof safe, locking the heavy steel door and spinning the combination dial. The clicking mechanism sounded like a vault, sealing a definitive truth. I walked back into the living room and retrieved my powered-down phone from the sofa. I did not turn it on. I left the screen dark, allowing my family to scream their threats into the digital void. I walked into my kitchen, poured a glass of cold water, and stood looking out over the quiet, sleeping neighborhood. The real war was about to begin, but for the first time in my life, I was holding the high ground. Tomorrow morning, I would locate the attorney who had drafted my grandmother's brilliant secret, and I would prepare to let my father march blindly toward the edge of his own ruin. The morning light filtering through my kitchen blinds felt remarkably clean. It carried none of the suffocating weight from the night before. I brewed a single cup of black coffee and dressed with purpose. My destination was not a high-gloss downtown law firm where partners wore $1,000 suits and charged by the minute to flatter their clients. I was driving to a modest brick building in Metairie to meet the architect of my grandmother's brilliant legal maneuver. Marcus Landry was a man who preferred substance over spectacle. Genevieve had chosen him precisely because he operated outside the incestuous social circles of the Garden District. He did not attend the same country club galas as my father. He owed no favors to the local judges Preston tried to impress. Landry was a bulldog of a litigator who specialized in ironclad estate planning, and he possessed a reputation for dismantling pretentious heirs with surgical efficiency. I parked in the narrow lot behind his office and carried the wax-sealed folder inside. Landry met me in his small waiting room. He wore a crisp, unpretentious gray suit and offered a firm, pragmatic handshake. He did not waste time offering hollow condolences. He recognized the hardened posture of a woman entering a battlefield. He ushered me into a sparse conference room smelling of old paper and bitter espresso. I placed the heavy parchment documents on his desk. Landry adjusted his reading glasses and scrutinized the pages. A faint, knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. He traced the blue ink of the parish clerk's stamps and ran his thumb over the raised notary seal. "This is exactly as we filed it," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "I drafted this instrument myself 3 years ago. Your grandmother sat in that exact chair you are occupying now. She possessed a terrifying clarity regarding your father's trajectory. She knew his vanity would eventually bankrupt the Swara name." Landry leaned back and steepled his fingers. I asked him if there was any vulnerability in the paperwork. I needed to know if Preston could find a hairline fracture to exploit. Landry shook his head with absolute certainty. An inter vivos donation in the state of Louisiana is one of the most formidable legal tools available. It is bulletproof. The moment this was recorded, the property ceased to belong to Genevieve's estate. It bypassed probate entirely. Preston is currently attempting to claim jurisdiction over a ghost. The deed to that house and the accompanying liquid assets are legally irreversibly yours. The confirmation settled over me, reinforcing the armor I had donned the previous night. But Landry was not finished. He opened a separate manila folder sitting on the corner of his desk. His expression shifted from satisfaction to grave, tactical focus. "We must discuss the variables you cannot see," Landry cautioned. He slid a printed spreadsheet across the desk. It contained a dizzying array of commercial property listings, bank loan numbers, and foreclosure warnings. You are operating under the assumption that your father is simply a greedy man attempting to steal a legacy. That is a dangerous underestimation. Preston is not just greedy, he is cornered. I scanned the spreadsheet, my analytical training digesting the raw data. The numbers painted a catastrophic picture. Preston had leveraged multiple commercial retail spaces against one another, taking out high-interest loans to fund properties that sat entirely vacant. His portfolio was a house of cards ready to collapse under a stiff breeze. "He is drowning in secret debt," Landry explained, tapping the paper with a pen. "He has managed to conceal the decay from your mother and the society columnists, but his creditors are losing patience. He requires a massive immediate influx of capital to satisfy these loans. The Garden District estate is the only unencumbered asset remaining in the Swara orbit. He desperately needs the sale of that house to avoid total catastrophic bankruptcy." The stakes of the conflict instantly doubled in height. Preston was not fighting for social prestige or a larger slice of a comfortable pie. He was fighting for his sheer survival. His frantic behavior in the dining room, the fake, unnotarized waiver, the desperate shouting, all of it stemmed from the primal terror of impending ruin. He needed me out of the way because my existence blocked his access to his only remaining lifeboat. "If I walk into his house today and show him this deed, the game ends," I said, laying out the logical next step. Landry held up a hand, stopping my line of thought. "If you reveal your hand today, Preston will panic. A panicked man with connections will find a sleazy lawyer willing to file endless frivolous injunctions. He will drag you into probate court, claiming elder abuse or mental incapacity. He will tie the property up in red tape for years, bleeding your own resources dry in legal fees just to stall his own demise. He will make your life a living hell out of pure spite." I looked at the veteran attorney, absorbing this strategic wisdom. I asked him for the alternative. Landry leaned forward, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Let them build their gallows. Right now, Preston believes he has successfully intimidated you. He believes his fabricated will is the ruling document. He will act on that belief. He will attempt to list the property. He will sign binding contracts with real estate agents. He will commit wire fraud trying to move those liquid assets. Every step he takes under the false assumption of ownership is another nail in his own coffin. The strategy was ruthless and elegant. It required a level of restraint that most people could not muster. It meant walking away from the confrontation and allowing the enemy to claim a hollow victory. "We practice total silence," Landry advised. "You do not answer his calls. You do not reply to the threats. You go back to your job and you live your life. You allow Preston to march blindly toward a cliff, armed only with his own towering arrogance. When he finally steps off the edge and the gravity of the law catches him, the impact will be fatal and undeniable. We spring the trap when he has no room left to maneuver." I agreed without hesitation. The plan appealed to my clinical nature. I shook Landry's hand, secured the original documents in his fireproof vault, and kept the certified copies in my possession. I left the brick building in Metairie, feeling an unprecedented sense of control. The transition back to my daily routine was jarring but necessary. I returned to the pharmacy for my scheduled shifts. I slipped my white coat over my shoulders and resumed the meticulous work of verifying dosages and consulting with patients. The contrast between my professional environment and the raging inferno of my family dynamic was stark. Here I was, a respected medical professional ensuring the health and safety of my community. Outside these sliding glass doors, I was the target of a vicious, coordinated assault. The silent strategy proved immediately effective and incredibly revealing. My phone became a continuous feed of hostility. Preston sent a barrage of emails using his official business account, demanding I return to the house to sign the waiver. His messages oscillated between condescending paternal advice and outright legal threats. Caroline left voicemails accusing me of abandoning the family in their time of grief, painting herself as a martyr suffering the burden of an ungrateful child. Cassandra sent sharp, cruel texts mocking my career and boasting about the lavish renovations she planned to make to her boutique using her impending inheritance. I read every single word. I documented every timestamp. I did not delete a single message, preserving them as digital evidence of their boundless entitlement. And true to Landry's directive, I offered zero response. The lack of engagement drove them to new heights of delusion. Because I did not fight back, they assumed I had surrendered. They interpreted my absence as a concession of defeat. They were so accustomed to my compliance that they could not fathom a scenario where my silence was a tactical maneuver. While I stood behind the raised linoleum counter counting hydrochlorothiazide and counseling diabetic patients, my father was accelerating his own destruction. He was moving forward with the grand illusion, assuming the Garden District estate was firmly within his grasp. He was preparing to invite the city's most ruthless realtors into my home to appraise my property so he could pay off his secret debts. He was marching toward the cliff just as Landry had predicted. The anticipation was a quiet, steady hum beneath my ribs, knowing that every arrogant step he took was bringing him closer to a fall he would never survive. 7 days elapsed without a single confrontation. The relentless vibrating of my phone ceased by the third morning. The hostile text messages demanding my submission transitioned into a smug, self-assured quiet. My family interpreted my refusal to engage as a white flag. To them, my absence from the mahogany dining room signified a retreat. They assumed I had slunk back to my modest apartment to lick my wounds and accept my lesser standing. They operated on a frequency of dominance and submission. Because I did not fight back with tears or shouted threats, they naturally concluded I had bowed to the inevitable. I spent my days standing behind the raised counter of the pharmacy, dispensing beta blockers and verifying insurance claims. I maintained a steady external rhythm while keeping a vigilant watch on the unfolding spectacle. The strategy of total silence was a heavy garment to wear, but it proved incredibly effective at coaxing them out into the open. My father wasted zero time. The looming threat of his commercial creditors acted as a sharp spur in his side. He moved swiftly to liquidate the asset he believed he had successfully secured. Through the neighborhood grapevine and a few well-placed digital breadcrumbs, I tracked his progress. He retained the services of an elite high society real estate broker known throughout the parish for moving historic properties with ruthless speed. Preston signed an exclusive listing agreement, projecting an asking price that would cover his failing retail investments and leave a comfortable surplus. He was negotiating the sale of a Garden District jewel he did not legally possess, shaking hands over expensive bourbon, and making firm promises to a broker who expected a swift, lucrative transaction. He was staking his remaining reputation on a phantom asset. My sister embraced her fabricated victory with characteristic greed. Cassandra possessed a profound talent for spending money she had not yet earned. She operated her failing candle and fragrance shop on a month-to-month basis, perpetually behind on inventory invoices. Armed with the promise of a sudden influx of capital, she decided an expansive upgrade was in order. She drove to a European auto dealership across town and placed a non-refundable cash down payment on a midnight blue luxury sport utility vehicle. She documented the purchase on her social media feed, posing beside the polished hood with a caption celebrating the rewards of patience and family loyalty. She was broadcasting her impending wealth to the entire city, solidifying her social standing on a foundation of sand. The pristine leather interior of that car was a trap she bought for herself. The vehicle purchase was merely the appetizer for her financial feast. Cassandra then scheduled a meeting with the leasing agents for the new waterfront commercial development. She signed a 10-year binding lease for a flagship retail space possessing prime foot traffic and an exorbitant monthly rent. She locked herself into a commercial contract that demanded heavy upfront capital and stringent financial guarantees. She was financing a lifestyle upgrade, relying entirely on a forged document. Every signature she placed on a binding agreement tightened a snare around her own neck. She was legally obligating herself to serious creditors, while her supposed safety net remained safely locked inside my fireproof safe. Her arrogant confidence fueled a spending spree that would leave her with inescapable liabilities. My mother enabled the delusion every step of the way. Caroline sent me a single text message on a Thursday afternoon. It contained a photograph of the estate formal parlor, now stripped of Genevieve's antique rugs in preparation for property staging. The message below the image read, "We are embracing this new chapter. It is a relief to finally have harmony and clear direction. We wish you the best in your modest pursuits." It was a thinly veiled gloat, a digital pat on the head from a woman who had spent decades enabling a tyrant. She wanted me to feel the sting of exclusion. I looked at the photograph of the bare hardwood floors and felt only a clinical fascination. They were staging my house for a sale I would never authorize. They were paying interior decorators to arrange furniture in rooms they no longer owned. While they accumulated catastrophic debt, I accumulated data. I sat at my small kitchen table evening after evening assembling a meticulous financial ledger. I pulled 4 years of banking statements. I highlighted every single transaction related to Genevieve's health care. The monthly cardiac prescriptions, the copays for specialist visits, the emergency medical transport bills that Preston had conveniently ignored when balancing his own checkbook. The numbers added up to a staggering sum. My family viewed my income as a crude working-class mechanism, yet that same mechanism had functioned as the life support system for the matriarch they claimed to revere. I organized the fading thermal paper receipts into a chronological binder, utilizing the same strict protocols I applied to tracking controlled substances at the pharmacy. I punched holes in the documents and sorted them by year, creating an undeniable paper trail. This was not a diary of grievances. It was an audited financial record ready for a judge to review. The tension of the waiting period was a tangible thing. It hovered in the humid air of my apartment, a low-frequency hum of impending consequence. Mr. Landry had warned me that the strategy required an iron stomach. I watched my father leverage his reputation on a fraudulent claim. I watched my sister plunge into 6-figure debt. The instinct to step in and halt the disaster before the damage became permanent is a deeply ingrained human response. We are conditioned to prevent our blood relatives from walking into oncoming traffic. But these people had shoved me toward the traffic and demanded I apologize for bleeding on the asphalt. I quelled the instinct. I sipped my black coffee and watched them accelerate toward the edge. Cassandra posted another update. She was touring expensive marble suppliers to select custom flooring for her new boutique. The tragedy of the golden child is the profound lack of survival skills. Preston had shielded her from the consequences of her poor business acumen for a decade, fostering a dangerous illusion of competence. She genuinely believed her sudden windfall was a testament to her inherent worth rather than a stolen prize. She was making legally binding commitments based on a piece of unnotarized printer paper Preston had produced in a dining room. The arrogance required to operate with such blind faith was breathtaking. She did not consult a lawyer. She did not request a certified bank statement. She simply trusted the patriarchal authority of a man who was actively sinking into his own ruin. The real estate broker began deploying his marketing apparatus. Drone photography of the estate grounds appeared on an exclusive listing portal. The descriptive text highlighted the historic wrought iron balconies, the original mahogany fixtures, and the rare opportunity to acquire a pristine piece of New Orleans history. Preston was allowing strangers to photograph my property. He was authorizing virtual tours of my grandmother's private quarters. He was spending marketing capital that the brokerage would eventually expect to recoup. The gears of the commercial real estate machine were grinding into motion, and those gears do not reverse easily. When a broker of that caliber invests time and reputation into a high-tier listing, he expects a smooth title transfer. The overlapping layers of deception were moving toward a spectacular collision point. Preston needed the property sale to satisfy his commercial lenders. Cassandra needed the estate liquidations to cover her new vehicle and the waterfront lease. Caroline needed the facade of wealth to maintain her country club status. Their entire collective future hinged on a single upcoming administrative procedure. In the state of Louisiana, before a high-value residential property can change hands, a mandatory legal checkpoint must be cleared. The broker must perform a comprehensive title search through the parish records to verify ownership and ensure no encumbrances exist. It is a standard routine process, examining digital databases and physical clerk files that catches every single discrepancy. I closed my financial binder and aligned it neatly with the edge of my table. My documentation was flawless. The pharmacy shifts kept my hands busy and my mind sharp. I knew the timeline. The broker would not delay. He would instruct his title company to pull the parish deeds before the end of the week to prepare the preliminary sale contracts. Preston was hosting a lavish dinner party on Friday to court the potential investors he intended to appease with the upcoming real estate profits. He was raising a glass to his own cleverness, surrounded by the city elite, unaware that the parish clerk held a registered, irrevocable donation bearing my name. The fuse was burning down to the final millimeter. The silence was about to end, and the resulting detonation would tear the Suara legacy down to the studs. The bureaucratic machinery of Orleans Parish operates with a sluggish indifference to human emotion. It does not factor in the prestige of a family name or the tailored cut of a patriarch's suit. The digital databases housing property records exist solely to catalog facts. When the elite real estate broker initiated the standard preliminary title search on the Garden District estate, he expected a routine verification process. He anticipated confirming Genevieve Suara as the owner of record moving swiftly to probate validation and attaching his brokerage firm to a highly lucrative commission. The software query required less than 30 seconds to return a result. The blinking text on the broker's dual monitor setup did not display a seamless line of inheritance. It flagged a critical ownership discrepancy. The system identified a registered act of donation inter vivos filed 3 years prior. The legal owner of the sprawling historic property was not the deceased matriarch. It was not a family trust managed by Preston. The deed was held free and clear by Valeria Suara. While the broker stared at the undeniable legal reality illuminating his screen, Preston was orchestrating a masterclass in deception. He had reserved a private dining alcove at one of the most exclusive Creole restaurants in the French Quarter. The table was set with heavy silver and crystal. He was hosting 2 prominent commercial lenders who held the perilous notes on his vacant retail properties. Preston had spent his entire adulthood relying on the gravitational pull of his surname to secure financial extensions. He possessed no actual business acumen. He inherited a reputation and used it as collateral. He was currently spinning a masterful narrative for the lenders, assuring them that the imminent liquidation of his mother's estate would provide the capital necessary to satisfy his overdue obligations. He poured vintage Bordeaux into their glasses, projecting the effortless ease of a man whose wealth is guaranteed. He was selling them a ghost. Preston's cell phone vibrated against the dark mahogany table. He glanced at the screen and noted the real estate broker's name. A surge of triumphant satisfaction warmed his chest. He assumed the broker was calling to confirm the listing timeline or to present an assertive marketing strategy. He offered a polite, reassuring smile to his investors and excused himself from the alcove. He walked out into the softly lit, carpeted corridor of the restaurant, expecting a conversation that would validate his impending financial rescue. He answered the call with a smooth, confident greeting. The broker did not return the pleasantry. The tone on the other end of the line was clipped and distinctly professional, signaling a sharp departure from their previous camaraderie. The broker informed Preston that the listing agreement they had signed was null and void. Preston chuckled a dry, dismissive sound, assuming a minor clerical error had caused a delay. He instructed the broker to navigate around the red tape. The broker clarified that there was no red tape to navigate. He read the details of the parish conveyance record directly into the phone. The property was not entangled in probate. It had been legally transferred away from Genevieve 36 months ago. The sole owner of record was Valeria. The words struck Preston with the blunt force of a physical blow. The elegant corridor of the restaurant seemed to tilt on its axis. He demanded the broker run the search again, accusing the title company of incompetence. The broker calmly replied that the documents were certified irreversible and publicly available. He advised Preston to consult his family attorney and promptly ended the call, severing their business relationship. Preston stood frozen against the textured wallpaper. The sophisticated facade he had meticulously maintained for decades fractured in a matter of seconds. The realization crushed his chest, restricting his airway. The unnotarized paper he had dramatically read in the formal dining room was not just a pathetic forgery. It was a glaring spotlight on his own profound ignorance. He had attempted to sell a multi-million-dollar asset that belonged to the very daughter he had just banished. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, and his own hand had pulled the lever. Panic, a raw, primal terror, replaced his aristocratic confidence. The investors sitting mere feet away in the private alcove were expecting a timeline for their repayment. If they discovered he had leveraged a property he did not own, they would initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings on his remaining commercial assets. The resulting bankruptcy would be public, humiliating, and permanent. He could not return to the table. He abandoned his guests, leaving the expensive wine and the unresolved debts behind. He stumbled out the rear exit of the restaurant, pushing past the kitchen staff, and burst into the humid evening air. He handed his ticket to the valet, his hands shaking so severely he dropped his leather wallet onto the pavement. I was sitting in the sterile quiet of the pharmacy break room when the first notification arrived. The space smelled of synthetic citrus cleaner and stale coffee. The digital clock on the wall read 8:14. My phone screen illuminated on the laminated table. It was a call from Preston. I did not reach for the device. I watched the caller identification flash until the system routed the connection to voicemail. A red indicator appeared, signaling a new audio message. 3 minutes later, the screen lit up again, then again. I retrieved a yellow-lined legal pad and a black pen from my locker. I sat down and initiated the playback, applying the same methodical detachment I use when transcribing complex physician orders. The audio sequence provided a clinical documentation of a man losing his grip on reality. The first voicemail registered at 8:16. Preston's voice was laced with volatile, demanding authority. "Valeria, pick up this phone immediately," he commanded. "There is a clerical error at the parish office regarding the estate title. You need to contact my broker and clear this up. Stop playing these childish games and call me back." He still believed he could order the tide to stop rising. He clung to the illusion that I was a subordinate waiting for instructions. I logged the time and summarized the tone on my notepad. The second and third messages arrived in rapid succession. The authority began to curdle into vicious threats. He warned me that if I did not sign the property over by morning, he would hire an army of litigators to destroy my medical license. He threatened to drag me into open court and expose me as a manipulative fraud who took advantage of a sick, elderly woman. He was projecting his own exact crimes onto me, attempting to weaponize his fear. By the fifth voicemail, the reality of the irrevocable donation had clearly penetrated his denial. The threats evaporated, replaced by a frantic bargaining phase. "Valeria, we need to handle this as a family," he reasoned, his breath catching in his throat. "You cannot manage a property of that magnitude. It requires capital and connections you do not possess. Come to the house tomorrow. We will draw up a fair contract. I will ensure you are compensated. Just answer the phone." He was offering to buy my own property back from me using funds he did not have. The sheer audacity was staggering, but it revealed the depth of his desperation. He was watching the walls of his kingdom close in, and he was searching for any available exit. The final message arrived at 8:42. The transformation was complete. The commanding patriarch, the man who had dismissed me as a common laborer in front of a prominent judge, was gone. The voice recording captured a hollow, terrified sound. "Valeria, please," he begged, the word cracking into a ragged plea. "The commercial lenders are going to call the notes on Monday. If I do not have the estate collateral, they will take everything. The family name will be ruined. Cassandra will lose her lease. Please pick up the phone. I am out of time." I sat in the fluorescent light of the break room, listening to the playback click to an end. 8 frantic voicemails spanning 28 minutes, a complete psychological collapse delivered in digital audio. A lesser person might have felt the urge to call him back to gloat over the victory or to demand the apology that was decades overdue. But engaging with a drowning man only gives him an opportunity to pull you under. I set my pen down. I did not delete the messages. I preserved them as a vital record of his admission of financial ruin. The silence I offered in return was not a passive act. It was a highly calibrated, deliberate dosage of consequence. By refusing to answer, I denied him the argument he craved. I denied him a target for his rage and a savior for his incompetence. I left him alone in the dark with the terrifying arithmetic of his own failures. I smoothed my white lab coat, stood up from the laminated table, and walked back out onto the pharmacy floor. The night shift required my attention. There were prescriptions to verify, and patients who genuinely needed care. My father was currently experiencing the excruciating agony of a trap springing shut. I knew that panic would not remain confined to his mobile phone. Silence drives entitled people to reckless action. When they cannot reach you from a distance, they attempt to breach your sanctuary. The digital assault had failed, and the physical invasion was inevitable. Thursday afternoon shifts represent a distinct battlefield. The rhythm inside the pharmacy is relentless and unforgiving. The drive-through warning bell chimes in a steady sequence, while the phones ring in an overlapping chorus. The queue of waiting patients stretches past the seasonal displays and bends around the greeting card aisle. I stand at the primary verification terminal, auditing a complex array of cardiovascular prescriptions. The air smells of sterile plastic and synthetic pine floor cleaner. This environment requires unyielding focus. It is governed by strict federal protocols where emotional outbursts hold zero currency. My white coat serves as my armor here. I dispense vital care to a community that relies on my precision. I do not have the luxury of losing my composure. The automatic sliding doors part with a mechanical hiss. A wave of damp heat rolls into the climate-controlled space, dragging a harsh disruption with it. I do not need to raise my head immediately to know the perimeter has been breached. The ambient murmur of the waiting crowd falters. People instinctively shuffle backward, making way for a chaotic, volatile energy. I finalize a prescription label, sign my initials, and lift my gaze. Preston and Cassandra are marching down the center aisle. The visual contrast is jarring. The Swara patriarch and the golden child look entirely foreign beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of a retail pharmacy. Preston wears a wrinkled linen suit jacket, a stark departure from his normally pristine tailoring. His posture is rigid but uneven, carrying the erratic momentum of a man operating on zero sleep and pure panic. His face bears a grayish pallor beneath his country club tan. Cassandra trails half a step behind him, gripping a leather designer handbag to her chest like a protective shield. Her usual mask of haughty aristocratic indifference has melted away. She looks brittle, terrified, and dangerously fragile. They are cornered animals storming a sanctuary because the fire has finally reached their den. They ignore the numbered queue. They bypass the privacy boundary taped onto the linoleum floor. An elderly man leaning on a walking cane takes a startled step aside as Preston shoves his way to the consultation window. "Valeria," he snarls. His voice lacks its usual resonant depth. It sounds ragged and breathless. "You are going to end this ridiculous stunt right now. You are going to sign the title transfer documents I brought, and we are going to fix this clerical error before you ruin everything." I place my pen flat on the clean white surface of my workstation. I study the man who spent my entire life attempting to minimize my worth. He is trying to wield authority in a domain where he holds zero jurisdiction. I am the lead pharmacist on duty. I dictate the rules within these four walls. I fold my hands together and meet his bloodshot eyes. You are standing in a designated patient privacy zone, Preston. I say, my tone remaining low and even. I ask that you step back behind the yellow line or leave the premises. My refusal to acknowledge his demand strips away another layer of his sanity. Cassandra lunges forward, pressing her manicured hands against the plexiglass divider separating us. "You cannot do this," she hisses, her voice pitching upward into a shrill tremor. "I signed a 10-year commercial lease today, Valeria. I put down a non-refundable cash deposit on a vehicle. You are stealing my future. You are tearing this family apart out of pure spite." I observe her frantic physical symptoms. Her hands shake against the clear plastic. The golden child is discovering that gravity applies to her just as it applies to everyone else. She operated on the blind assumption that Genevieve's wealth would subsidize her vanity projects forever. She signed personal guarantees for luxury assets she could not afford. Now she is staring down the barrel of crushing liability and expects me to throw myself on a grenade to save her. I address her with the same professional detachment I offer to patients demanding early refills on restricted narcotics. You signed binding financial contracts based on a forged piece of printer paper, Cassandra. That represents a catastrophic lack of judgment on your part. It is not my responsibility to fund your poor decisions. The truth strikes Preston like a physical blow. The remaining shreds of his aristocratic restraint vaporize. He raises his right hand and brings it down hard against the consultation counter. The impact echoes through the store, rattling the plastic organizing bins and causing the waiting patients to flinch. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little fraud," he roars. Saliva spots the plexiglass separating us. "You will sign the Garden District deed back over to the Swara Trust today. If you refuse, I will hire a team of litigators to bury you. I will contact the state medical board and claim you abused a vulnerable patient to secure a fraudulent donation. I will ensure your license is revoked. You will never practice pharmacy in this city or any other city again. Do you understand me?" He hurls heavy artillery, hoping the threat of professional ruin will finally force my submission. He fails to realize that an innocent person does not fear a baseless investigation. He assumes a state regulatory board operates on the same gossip and favoritism as his country club committees. The Inter Vivos donation was drafted by a respected attorney and certified by independent medical professionals. His threats are empty shells fired from a broken weapon. A lesser professional might engage in the shouting match to defend their honor. I recognize a safety hazard when I see one. I do not raise my voice. I do not defend my medical license. I maintain eye contact with the desperate, flailing patriarch, and I press the silent panic button mounted beneath the lip of my workstation. It signals the private security team. We maintain a zero-tolerance policy for aggressive behavior toward staff. I watch the realization slowly dawn on Cassandra as two broad-shouldered security guards in dark uniforms round the corner of the seasonal aisle and flank my family members. "Sir, you need to step away from the counter," the lead guard says, his hand resting near his radio. Preston whips his head around, astounded that hired muscle would dare address a man of his supposed stature. "Do you know who I am?" he demands, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of dominance. "I am Preston Swara. I demand to speak to the store manager." The guard remains unimpressed. "Sir, I am asking you once to leave the premises peacefully. If you refuse, we will contact law enforcement and have you cited for trespassing." The humiliation is profound and searingly public. The patriarch of a legacy New Orleans family is being treated like a common vagrant in the middle of a retail chain. The customers stare openly while a few lift their smartphones to record the altercation. Cassandra covers her face with her free hand, mortified by the digital exposure. She turns and practically runs toward the sliding glass doors, desperate to escape the watching eyes and the glowing screens. Preston resists. He attempts to plant his feet on the linoleum, but the guards close the distance, placing firm hands on his arms and physically guiding him backward. He thrashes against their grip, his tailored suit pulling tight across his shoulders. He is losing the last vestige of his dignity in real time. "You are bankrupting us!" he screams, his voice cracking as he is forced down the main aisle, past the checkout registers. "You are a thief. You are destroying your own blood." I step out from behind the plexiglass divider. The ambient noise of the store has vanished entirely. Every eye is fixed on the spectacle unfolding near the exit. I project my voice so it carries clearly over his frantic shouting, reaching him just as the automatic doors slide open to eject him into the humid afternoon heat. "We will discuss your eviction at Mr. Landry's office on Friday," I state. The sentence slices through the tension, chilling and precise. It confirms his worst fear. He is not merely losing the estate, he is being legally expelled from it. The doors close behind him, cutting off his final ragged response. The invasion has spectacularly failed. My colleagues exchange stunned glances, trying to process the scene they just witnessed. The waiting patients slowly return to their places in line, shifting their attention back to their own ailments. I walk back to my workstation, adjust my collar, and call the next number. The conflict is sealed, and the terrain belongs entirely to me. The Friday morning sky was a pale, overcast gray, casting a flat, even light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law office in Metairie. The conference room was a marvel of modern minimalism. It featured polished concrete floors, frosted glass partitions, and a long rectangular table carved from a single slab of dark walnut. The environment was engineered to project quiet, unyielding authority. I sat in a high-backed leather chair positioned strategically facing the door. My hands rested in my lap, folded loosely over the manila folder containing my medical receipts. Beside me, Marcus Landry exuded the relaxed posture of a veteran litigator who already knew the verdict before the trial began. He had a closed manila envelope resting near his right hand. We did not speak. The quiet was our shared strategy. We were simply waiting for the opposing party to walk into the enclosure. The heavy glass doors swung inward at precisely 9 o'clock. Preston entered first, attempting to lead with his customary patriarchal stride, but his physical mechanics betrayed him. His shoulders carried a rigid, unnatural tension. He wore a navy suit that looked as though he had slept in it, the fabric creased across the back. Caroline followed a step behind him, clutching a designer handbag to her stomach, as if it could deflect incoming fire. Cassandra entered third, her eyes darting around the minimalist room, taking in the expensive art and the severe architecture. The Golden Child looked profoundly out of her depth, stripped of her Garden District backdrop. They did not come alone. Bringing up the rear was a man who clearly did not belong in an elite estate dispute. He wore a boxy charcoal suit with a tie that clashed against a wrinkled collar. He carried a battered leather briefcase and presented a demeanor of forced, blustering confidence. This was the discount attorney Preston had procured in a panic, a rapid hire necessitated by the fact that no reputable firm in New Orleans would touch a fraudulent probate claim against an airtight parish deed. The man dropped his briefcase onto the walnut table with an audible thud, a crude tactic designed to establish dominance. Landry did not flinch. He offered a tight, polite smile and invited them to sit. The cheap lawyer cleared his throat and opened a legal pad, preparing to launch into a rehearsed opening statement about equitable settlements and avoiding drawn-out litigation. Preston waved a hand, silencing his own counsel, before the man could articulate a single syllable. Preston could not surrender the floor. His ego demanded that he control the narrative. He leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the wood, adopting the posture of a benevolent king, offering clemency to a rebellious subject. "Valeria," he began, his voice straining for its usual resonant depth. "You have made your point. You staged a very dramatic scene at the pharmacy, and you caused your sister a great deal of unnecessary distress. We are willing to overlook that unfortunate behavior. We are here today because we recognize that grief makes people act irrationally." I maintained my silence. I studied his respiratory rate, noting the shallow breaths and the slight tremor in his jaw. He was projecting a facade of compromise while standing over a financial abyss. He mistook my silence for receptiveness and pressed onward, warming up to his own fabricated narrative. "We all know that Mother was not in her right mind during those final years," he stated, shaking his head with feigned sorrow. "Her cardiac condition restricted her blood flow. She was confused. She was vulnerable. It is obvious that you spent those long evenings filling her head with exaggerated stories of your own hardships, manipulating a sick woman into signing paperwork she did not comprehend. You took advantage of her declining state to secure a document that circumvents centuries of Swara family tradition." Caroline nodded vigorously beside him, playing the role of the wounded mother. She leaned across the table, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. We are your family, Valeria. You owe a duty to the people who raised you. Tearing us apart over money is a tragedy Genevieve never would have wanted. Preston raised a hand to silence his wife, reclaiming the spotlight. We are prepared to be generous, he declared. My attorney has drafted a settlement agreement. We will offer you a substantial cash payout drawn directly from the liquid assets of the estate. In exchange, you will sign a quit-claim deed transferring the Garden District property back to the family trust where it belongs. You take the money, you return to your quiet life, and we save the family name from a humiliating public spectacle. It is the only honorable path forward. He sat back, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for the relief to wash over my face. He truly believed he was offering a lifeline. He thought he could buy my compliance with a fraction of the fortune he intended to steal. He assumed I was frightened of the legal machine and desperate for his validation. He had just delivered a monologue confessing his intent to bribe a property owner into surrendering a multi-million-dollar asset based on a profound lie. I did not offer a rebuttal. I did not defend my grandmother's mental acuity or list the countless times I had subsidized the very roof he was trying to reclaim. I turned my head slowly and looked at Marcus Landry. The veteran attorney nodded. He unclasped his hands and retrieved the thick envelope resting on his side of the table. He did not rush. He withdrew the heavy parchment documents featuring the blue parish stamps and the raised notary seals. He fanned the pages out across the center of the dark walnut table, ensuring the official crests caught the morning light. Mr. Suara Landry set his voice a low, gravelly hum that commanded instant obedience. You seem to labor under a severe misunderstanding of Louisiana's civil code. We are not here to negotiate a settlement. There is nothing to settle. The discount lawyer leaned forward, squinting at the parish stamps. The color drained from his face as he recognized the specific formatting of the paperwork. This is an act of donation, inter vivos. Landry continued tapping the parchment with his index finger. It was executed 36 months ago by a woman who scored in the 99th percentile on her cognitive evaluation that very same week. The medical affidavits are attached in Exhibit A. She was not confused. She possessed a terrifying clarity regarding the financial decay of her own lineage. Preston stared at the documents. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords failed to produce a sound. Furthermore, Landry stated, leaning closer to the center of the table, this instrument transferred naked ownership of the entire estate, both real property and liquid capital, directly to Valeria. Genevieve retained only the usufruct, the legal right to reside in the home and utilize the income until her passing. She orchestrated this specific transfer for a very precise reason. Landry paused, allowing the legal reality to permeate the air. Then he delivered the fatal blow. Genevieve Suara engaged my services because she knew you were bankrupting the family name, he said, looking Preston dead in the eye. She watched you leverage your commercial properties into ruin. She knew you were hiding catastrophic debts from your social circle, and she knew you would liquidate her ancestral home the moment she died to save your own vanity. She intentionally stripped you of your inheritance to protect the only person in this bloodline who possessed actual integrity. She legally amputated your access to her wealth 3 years ago to ensure her legacy would not be squandered on your failed investments. The trap sprang shut with an audible metallic finality. The room went dead silent. The truth hung in the cold air, conditioning a heavy, undeniable verdict. Preston had walked into the conference room expecting to bully a subordinate into a cheap settlement. He was now sitting across from a seasoned litigator, holding ironclad proof that his own mother had foreseen his treachery, evaluated his character, and preemptively engineered his total ruin. There was no loophole. There was no negotiation. He was staring at a legal dead end built by the very woman he thought he had outsmarted. The discount attorney reached across the dark walnut surface. His fingers hesitated a fraction of a second before making contact with the heavy parchment. He pulled the documents closer, adjusting his wrinkled collar as his eyes scanned the dense legal text. I watched his gaze track the blue ink of the parish stamps and the raised notary seals. The manufactured confidence he brought into the room evaporated within 30 seconds. He flipped to the second page, reading the clauses regarding the usufruct and the irrevocable transfer of bare ownership. A fine layer of perspiration formed along his hairline. He understood the lethal nature of a correctly executed Louisiana donation. He recognized he was sitting on the wrong side of an unwinnable battle. He did not offer a booming objection. He did not attempt to argue precedent or cite obscure loopholes. He simply closed the file and pushed it back toward the center of the table. He leaned close to Preston, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper that carried easily in the quiet room. "You have no case, Preston. The deed is certified. If you try to challenge this in open court, the judge will sanction you for filing a frivolous claim, and they will likely refer the forgery to the district attorney. I am dropping you as a client." The lawyer did not wait for a dismissal. He grabbed the handle of his battered briefcase, stood up from the leather chair, and walked out the glass door without a backward glance. He fled the sinking ship before the water reached the deck. The click of the door latch acted as a detonator. The carefully constructed reality of the Swara family imploded. The silence shattered, replaced by the frantic, ugly sounds of profound realization. Cassandra was the first to break. The haughty indifference she wore like a protective shield cracked down the middle. She stared at the empty chair the lawyer had just abandoned, her mind desperately trying to calculate the impending disaster. She had spent the last week operating on the blind assumption that a multi-million-dollar payout was guaranteed. She had signed a binding 10-year commercial lease for a waterfront retail space her boutique could never afford. She had drained her meager savings to secure a non-refundable cash down payment on a midnight blue luxury vehicle. She had financed a kingdom on the promise of a ghost. The reality of her crushing liability crashed over her. Genuine panicked tears spilled over her eyelashes, ruining her meticulous makeup. She gripped the edge of the walnut table, her knuckles stark white. She turned her tear-streaked face toward our father. "You told me it was handled," she cried, her voice a jagged, discordant wail. "You told me the money was secured. I signed those contracts, Preston. The dealership, the leasing agents, they are going to demand their payments next week. I do not have the capital. They are going to sue me. They are going to take everything." Preston sat paralyzed. The man who dictated terms to everyone in his orbit had lost the capacity to speak. His jaw worked silently as he stared at the parchment documents that had just erased his future. The panic rippled outward, striking Caroline. My mother had tolerated Preston's infidelities and his cold demeanor for decades because he provided the Garden District address and the country club membership. She had sacrificed her own moral compass to maintain her position in the city hierarchy. Now the foundation of her social standing was revealed to be a rotting hollow shell. She looked at Marcus Landry, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "What does he mean about secret debts?" Caroline demanded, her voice trembling. She looked from the attorney to her husband. "Preston, what is he talking about? What commercial loans?" Preston refused to meet her gaze. He stared fixedly at his own hands. His silence provided all the confirmation she needed. The fragile, toxic truce that had governed their marriage for 30 years disintegrated. Caroline realized she was tethered to a man who had secretly gambled away their entire livelihood. She stood up from her seat, the heavy wooden chair scraping harshly against the polished concrete floor. "You lied to me," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You sat at the country club sipping bourbon and pretending we were untouchable while you drowned us in debt. You tried to steal a house you already lost. You bankrupt fool. You have turned us into a laughingstock. The society wives are going to evict us from every committee in the parish. We are going to be destitute." They turned on each other with the vicious speed of starved animals. The aristocratic veneer burned away, revealing a husband and wife who despised one another, bound together only by their shared greed and their impending ruin. Cassandra buried her face in her hands, sobbing audibly as she calculated the ruinous penalties awaiting her. Preston shouted back at Caroline, blaming her lavish spending habits for his financial shortfalls. The glass-walled conference room descended into utter chaos. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, observing the wreckage. I did not feel a surge of joyous triumph. I felt the steady, clarifying chill of a long-delayed reckoning. They had spent my entire life treating me as a crude necessity, a disappointing burden they had to endure. Now they were tearing themselves apart over the scraps of a fortune they had failed to steal. I waited for their shouting to subside. When their voices grew hoarse and the reality of their inescapable doom settled over them, the room fell into a heavy, ragged quiet. I folded my hands together and spoke for the first time since the discount lawyer had fled the room. My voice was low, steady, and devoid of any lingering affection. It carried the precise clinical tone I used to deliver terminal diagnoses. "You spent this entire ordeal demanding loyalty," I said, looking at the three of them. "You sat in that formal dining room and called me ungrateful. You accused me of lacking respect for a lineage that only ever took from me. So let us examine the ledger. Let us look at the actual cost of your beloved family tradition. I opened my own manila folder. I withdrew the single sheet of paper I had prepared the night before. It contained a summarized total of the detailed spreadsheet I had built at my kitchen table. Over the last 48 months, I spent $46,800 ensuring Genevieve's heart kept beating, I stated, reading the precise figure into the quiet room. I paid for the daily cardiac medications you deemed too expensive. I covered the specialist copays you ignored. I funded the private transport vehicles when her mobility failed because you refused to alter your social calendar to drive her to the clinic. I spent my own wages, the common working-class money you despised to keep your mother alive. I let the number hang in the air. Preston stared at the table, his face an ashen mask. While I was paying for her oxygen, you were drafting fake documents to steal her home. I continued. You handed me a $5,000 invoice for crab cakes and vintage wine so you could perform your grief for a parlor full of strangers. You attempted to shame me for refusing to fund your theatrical production. You thought you could simply wave a hand and erase me from the narrative because you believed you held all the leverage. You believed I was too weak to read the fine print. I picked up a second document from my folder. It was a formal legal notice drafted by Mr. Landry, printed on heavy stock paper and bearing an official watermark. I reached across the dark walnut table and slid the document toward Preston. It came to rest directly on top of the Louisiana donation papers. You wanted to discuss property transfers? I said, my gaze locking onto his defeated eyes. Consider it discussed. This is a formal 30-day notice to vacate. The words struck him with physical force. He flinched his shoulders, slumping inward. You have exactly 30 days to remove your personal belongings from my property, I told him. You will not remove a single piece of antique furniture. You will not touch the silver collection. You will not take anything that belongs to the estate. If you remain on the premises on day 31, I will have the parish sheriff remove you for trespassing. Caroline let out a stifled sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Cassandra squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to look at the eviction notice resting on the table. They had arrived expecting to banish me to the margins of their lives. They were leaving without a home, without a car, without a shred of social standing, and without a single dollar to their names. I did not wait for an apology. I did not wait for Preston to attempt another pathetic negotiation. I had delivered the medicine, and the consultation was officially over. I stood up from the leather chair, smoothed the front of my dress, and picked up my manila folder. Mr. Landry offered a brief, respectful nod, acknowledging the flawless execution of the strategy. I turned my back on my father, my mother, and my sister. I walked out of the glass-walled conference room, leaving them to drown in the shallow, toxic puddle of their own arrogance. My footsteps echoed softly down the carpeted corridor, a steady rhythm carrying me away from the wreckage and toward a future I owned free and clear. 30 days translates to precisely 720 hours. I track the passage of time with the same rigorous adherence I apply to a strict medication taper. The law demands a specific window for an eviction to become binding, and I offered my family not a single minute of leniency beyond the court-ordered deadline. On the 31st morning, I stood on the wide wraparound porch of the Garden District estate. The heavy, humid air carried the scent of wet oak leaves and river water. Beside me, a hired locksmith drilled into the ancient brass deadbolts. The high-pitched whine of the metal carving into metal was a functional industrial sound. It represented the final physical severing of the Swara lineage from the property they had attempted to steal. The locksmith extracted the old cylinder and slid the new tumblers into place. The lock clicked shut with a sharp, definitive snap. I accepted the 2 new silver keys, pressing the cold metal into the palm of my hand. The fortress was secure. My family had vacated the premises 48 hours prior. There was no fleet of professional movers driving pristine white trucks. Preston could not afford the discreet luxury services he once utilized to maintain his image. He rented a standard moving van and hired day laborers to load whatever personal belongings the eviction notice permitted him to take. He was strictly forbidden from touching the antique furniture, the silver collections, or the imported rugs. He left the grand estate carrying cardboard boxes filled with tailored suits he no longer had occasions to wear. The financial reckoning Landry had predicted executed itself with terrifying speed. Without the collateral of the ancestral home, Preston's commercial lenders initiated immediate foreclosure procedures on his vacant retail spaces. The cascading debt consumed his remaining liquid capital within a fortnight. He was forced to liquidate his golf club memberships and sell his vintage watch collection just to secure a lease on a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a lesser suburb far outside the prestigious boundaries of the city. Caroline accompanied him into exile. The toxic fracture in their marriage remained, but she lacked the independent resources to leave him. They were bound together in a suffocating prison of their own design, living in a space smaller than the formal dining room they once used to stage their ambush. The social fallout was swift and merciless. New Orleans high society operates on a currency of whispered gossip and ruthless exclusion. The elite circles they had spent decades cultivating turned their backs the moment the bank notices became public record. The invitations to charity galas and seasonal balls ceased arriving. When Caroline attempted to attend a routine committee luncheon at her former club, she was politely turned away at the door by the dining manager, citing a lapse in her membership dues. They became instant pariahs, erased from the social registry with the same cold detachment they had once tried to apply to me. Cassandra experienced a specialized version of this ruin. The golden child watched her fabricated empire dissolve in real time. The midnight blue luxury sport utility vehicle she had proudly displayed on her social media feed was repossessed on a Thursday afternoon. A tow truck arrived at her high-rise apartment complex and hauled the vehicle away while her affluent neighbors watched from their balconies. The waterfront commercial lease she had eagerly signed defaulted before she could even secure the building permits. The leasing consortium initiated a lawsuit for breach of contract, forcing her to file for personal bankruptcy. She lost her boutique. She lost her luxury apartment. She was forced to rent a modest studio unit, managing the register at a chain retail store to cover her basic utilities. The aristocratic illusion she wore like a shield shattered, leaving her exposed to the very working-class reality she had spent her entire life mocking. I turned the new silver key in the heavy front door and pushed it open. I stepped into the grand foyer. The silence inside the house was different now. During the weeks following the funeral, the quiet had felt heavy and expectant, like a predator holding its breath. Now the silence was light, breathable, and profoundly peaceful. The architecture seemed to exhale. I walked across the polished hardwood floors, listening to the steady rhythm of my own footsteps echoing in the vast space. I did not feel the oppressive weight of patriarchal expectations or the stinging bite of sibling rivalry. I felt only the solid, grounded reality of ownership. I passed the formal mahogany dining room. The long table sat empty, bathed in the soft morning light filtering through the velvet drapes. I looked at the exact chair where Preston had delivered his fraudulent verdict and felt nothing. The ghosts of their arrogance had been swept out the door, along with their cardboard boxes. I continued down the main corridor and entered Genevieve's private study at the rear of the house. This room was her true sanctuary. It smelled of aged paper, dried lavender, and lemon oil. The walls were lined with towering mahogany bookshelves, housing decades of literary collections. I walked over to her heavy oak reading desk, running my fingertips along the smooth grain. Beside the antique brass lamp sat a stack of her favorite volumes. The top book was an early edition of Southern Botanical Illustrations, a text she had frequently studied while sitting on the veranda. I picked it up, feeling the worn texture of the leather binding. As I opened the cover, a folded piece of heavy parchment slipped from the pages and fluttered down onto the desk. I set the book aside and picked up the parchment. It was a single sheet of stationery bearing her personal monogram. I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. It possessed the shaky, uneven loops of her final years, but the pressure of the ink revealed a firm, deliberate intent. It was not a legal document or a formal directive. It was a private letter, undated, and left hidden in a place she knew only a careful, observant mind would eventually search. My dearest Valeria. The letter began, "If you are reading this in the quiet of my study, it means the storm has passed. It means you stood your ground. I watched you for years carrying the weight of this family on your shoulders while asking for nothing in return. I saw your father construct his kingdom of debt, and I saw your sister lose herself to vanity. But I also saw you. I watched you choose discipline over entitlement. I watched you build a life of genuine substance. I paused, taking a slow, steady breath. The words resonated in the quiet room, carrying the warmth of a voice I deeply missed. They will tell you that wealth is a birthright, the letter continued. They are foolish. True legacy is not inherited. It is earned through integrity and protected by unwavering boundaries. I transferred this house to you because you are the only one strong enough to guard its doors. Do not let their bitterness infect your peace. You owe them nothing. You have already paid your dues in full. I am so profoundly proud of the woman you became. Pour a cup of coffee, sit on the veranda, and enjoy your home. You earned every inch of it. I folded the letter and pressed it against my chest. A deep sense of closure washed over me. I did not shed tears of grief. I felt a firm, anchoring validation. Genevieve had orchestrated the perfect defense from beyond the grave, ensuring that her most loyal descendant would never be subjected to the cruelty of the people who sought to exploit her. She had handed me a sword and trusted me to swing it. I placed the letter carefully inside the center drawer of the oak desk, preserving it alongside the certified parish deeds. I walked out of the study and headed toward the kitchen. Now I sit on the wraparound veranda, watching the early morning light catch the leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the street. A warm breeze rolls off the river, carrying the familiar scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The wrought iron gates are locked, securing the perimeter of my sanctuary. I hold a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, letting the heat warm my palms. I am wearing my crisp white pharmacy coat over my scrubs, preparing for the morning shift. I still count medications down to the milligram. I still earn my living standing behind a linoleum counter, ensuring the health of my community. The acquisition of a multi-million-dollar estate did not alter my fundamental character. It merely removed the parasites draining my energy. I take a slow sip of the coffee. My phone rests on the wrought iron table, silent and unbothered by frantic demands or toxic guilt trips. I defeated a lineage of old money arrogance without ever raising my voice or compromising my professional detachment. I allowed their own greed to construct the trap, and I simply waited for them to step inside. The grand house behind me stands as a monument to clinical patience and the quiet, undeniable power of truth. I check my watch, note the time, and stand up to begin my day. The invisible workhorse is gone. The matriarch has officially taken her seat.
We spend our lives building. We accumulate assets, curate our reputations, and construct elaborate family narratives, desperately hoping to pass down something of lasting value to the next generation. We call it establishing a legacy. Yet when we look closely at the spectacular quiet collapse of the Swara family, we are forced to confront a chilling reality. What happens when the legacy we pass down is nothing more than a beautifully dressed lie? The tragedy of Preston, Cassandra, and Caroline, and the quiet triumph of Valeria serves as a profound mirror for modern parenting, reflecting the dangerous currents that run beneath the surface of traditional family structures in American culture. At the very heart of this story lies the quiet, devastating tragedy of the divided household. In our eagerness to see our own ambitions realized, parents sometimes inadvertently cast their children into rigid, suffocating roles. Cassandra was anointed the golden child. She was shielded from consequence, showered with unearned capital, and taught that her mere existence entitled her to a life of luxury. We often think we are loving our children by paving their roads and removing their obstacles. But the Swara family proves that this brand of conditional performance-based favoritism is not love at all. It is a profound disservice. By insulating Cassandra from financial reality, Preston did not protect her. He severely handicapped her. He raised a daughter who possessed the arrogance to sign 10-year commercial leases with phantom money, but lacked the basic survival skills to weather a single day of actual hardship. On the opposite ends of this toxic spectrum stood Valeria, the invisible workhorse. She was expected to absorb the family's dysfunction, subsidize their crumbling facade, and accept a lesser standing simply because she chose an honest, unglamorous profession. As parents, we must cultivate the emotional awareness to value our children for who they actually are, rather than how well they reflect our own social aspirations. A child should never have to buy their parents' affection by funding their illusions. This brings us to a cornerstone of American culture, the dignity of independent labor. The United States is a nation built on the ideal of meritocracy. the belief that hard work and personal integrity hold more value than an inherited surname. Yet, in pockets of deep-rooted old money tradition, honest labor is sometimes sneered at. Preston dismissed Valeria's career as a pharmacist as a common path. He viewed her grueling shifts and precise life-saving work as an embarrassment to the lineage. But it was that very common path, that steady, independent income, that kept his own mother alive while he squandered his inheritance on hollow vanity projects. The greatest inheritance we can leave our children is not a trust fund or a historic estate. It is the grit, the work ethic, and the moral compass required to stand on their own 2 feet. When we teach our children to rely on inherited privilege rather than their own capabilities, we set them on a direct path toward ruin. Furthermore, the Swara family forces us to examine how we wield the wealth we do manage to build. In that dim mahogany dining room, Preston attempted to weaponize his mother's estate. He used the promise of inheritance as a leash, a tool of manipulation designed to force his daughter into submission. When inheritance becomes a mechanism for control, the family ceases to be a sanctuary and becomes a cold, transactional boardroom. Wealth should be a gift of generational transfer, not a blunt instrument used to punish independence. If love is tied to financial compliance, children will either grow up harboring deep, silent resentments, or they will become opportunistic predators waiting in the wings for their parents to falter. To prevent this, parents must find the courage to let their children face the natural consequences of their actions. Preston spent his life hiding his own commercial failures and enabling his daughter's reckless spending. He believed he was preserving the family honor. Instead, he was building a towering cliff for them both to fall from. True parental love sometimes requires stepping back and allowing a child to fail. It means letting them pay the late fees, navigate the broken contracts, and feel the sting of their own misjudgments. It is only in the crucible of consequence that true resilience is forged. We must also recognize the quiet complicity of those who stand by and watch. Caroline, the mother, chose the comfort of her country club status over the ethical duty to protect her exploited daughter. She chose the facade over the truth. A family culture built on avoiding difficult truths will eventually collapse under the weight of its own secrets. The only tradition worth preserving in any family is one anchored in honesty, fairness, and mutual respect. If this story resonates with you, if you have ever found yourself cast as the invisible workhorse in your own family, or if you are a parent striving to break these generational cycles and raise resilient, independent children, you are not alone. These are the complex, unspoken dynamics that shape our lives behind closed doors. We explore these deep, hidden currents every single week. Join our community and follow the Still Drama Stories channel to uncover more narratives that challenge our perspectives and reveal the quiet truths of human nature. In the end, we must look to the matriarch Genevieve. She possessed the heartbreaking clarity to see the rot spreading through her own lineage. She understood that to save the tree, she had to cut away the dying branches. She bypassed the loud, entitled heirs and quietly handed the keys to the only person who possessed the integrity to hold them. It leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable question as we look around our own dining room tables. When the time comes to pass the torch, what are we actually handing down? Are we leaving behind a fortress built on truth, resilience, and unconditional love? Or are we just leaving behind a set of heavy, antique keys to a house haunted by the ghosts of our own unresolved pride? The answer, much like the reflection in a dark, quiet window, is something only you can truly see.